basically conventional wisdom shifted entirely in the other direction, where it came to short-term interest rates from the Federal Reserve policy. Everybody said, with the payroll report being so solid, some saying it was a blowout, the July rate cut was an impossibility. It was taken completely off the table. Well, we got the text from the FOMC meeting minutes from their previous meeting, which, to be clear, does not include the June payroll report because they came out after the meeting. But these minutes are intended to send a message, and the minutes are taken to be, they do tend to, they do incorporate new information. In fact, there's a number of examples where the meeting itself and the press conference afterwards sounds one way and goes in one direction, only for the meeting minutes to come out afterward and be from the same exact minute and be completely opposite, the same exact meeting. Best example of that is probably December of 2018. The minutes came out a couple of weeks after December 2018, the final rate hike of that cycle. Suddenly the Fed says, after hiking rates and thinking that we're going to continue, suddenly they're saying, oh, maybe we're going to pause here. That was a famous example of the minutes not really lining up with the interpretation or the mainstream impression of the FOMC meeting because of subsequent information between when it was held and when the minutes were published a couple of weeks later. July of last year, which the minutes came out in August, we'll go over that here in just a second. But the point here is that the minutes came out yesterday, and after everybody said the July rate cut is off the table, it's not. It's actually on the table, and there's every reason to believe that it's not only a live possibility, I don't want to say it's a majority possibility, but it's a, I'll use their term, a solid possibility. So let's get into it here with the FOMC minutes. By the way, I wish we didn't have to do this, to always pay attention to the Fed and to go over and parse every report, every meeting, every speech, everything. It's just, I long for the day when we just don't have to do that anymore. But since the Federal Reserve does influence the short-term end of the yield curve, we have to at least pay attention to them from time to time, so long as they continue to do that. So here we go. Let's parse some meeting minutes text, because in this case, I do think it's important because it goes beyond just the short-term interest rates, and the short-term interest rate and policy rate. It goes far into other matters. So I don't believe the payrolls are actually going to change anyone's mind, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second, especially since the rest of the labor data, and I mean specifically the establishment survey, was pretty grim to begin with. And I've made this point over and over ever since the payroll numbers came out a week ago. There was a lot in it that was absolutely concerning, and I'll highlight those parts again just briefly, just to show you what I'm talking about here. Inflation fears that are being expressed by these certain clique of policymakers, the hawks, they're not really that hawkish. Any inflation fears that they're expressing are entirely theoretical. They haven't shown up in current CPIs, and if they do show up because of tariffs in future CPIs, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's inflationary. So the entire point, or the entire understanding and fear that comes from that set of policymakers is completely theoretical. Whereas employment concerns, again, as we'll go over here in just a second, are not theoretical. They are happening already. So the balance of risk, despite what Jay Powell says in public, the balance of risk is decidedly not balanced. Therefore, the committee isn't actually balanced. There is as much of a divide on the FOMC as certainly the mainstream media has made it out to be. And the FOMC text had that part in it. The actual minutes said that a small number of supporters or a number of supporters are arguing, or they say, if the data continues to go along in the way that they expect, they would support a rate cut. They would support a rate cut here in the month of July. And the data they're talking about is not payrolls. And we'll go over what that is in just a minute here too. And finally, one last bit of housekeeping. Bond vigilantism, it's just not happening. Every time long-term interest rates rise for a little bit, for a couple of weeks, just a fluctuation, the media is filled with these stories about how, oh my God, this is the end of the market for the Treasury, it's the end of the 40-year bond bull, or whatever else that they talk about. It's just a fluctuation. They oversell it, they overdo it. We got a 10-year note auction yesterday, which becomes the latest example of how none of that is ever true. We wish it was true. We wish there were bond vigilantes. The point is, just because you want something to happen doesn't mean it's actually going to happen, let alone that it is actually happening. And it's all related to, it goes back to everything with the FOMC and the waffling and interference in the front end of the yield curve there. So let's start out with the minutes of the FOMC meeting. The idea of a divide actually comes from this part of the text right here. Some participants commented they saw the risk of elevated inflation as remaining more prominent or as having diminished by less than risks to employment. That sounds like, oh my God, there's a divide here. A few participants saw risks to the labor market as having become more predominant. So you got like the, the Sharks and the Jets from West Side Story. You got the Sharks over there talking about inflation risks and how they're more predominant. You got the Jets over here talking about employment risks are more predominant, and they're not going to be able to come to grips with anything. And so we've got the split on the FOMC, which means basically not much is going to happen from here on out. However, they say that they noticed a few signs of weakening in real activity in the labor market and commented that conditions could weaken further in the future, especially if policy were still restricted. Policy doesn't matter. The economy doesn't care about the Fed's interest rates. However, they do see the signs of weakening, and that's in there, whereas what's missing from this very passage, which seems to set out this divide in FOMC, what's missing from it is they haven't noted any signs of actual inflation in real activity. That's an important point, which we'll come back to repeatedly, because it's entirely theoretical. These inflation fears stem, first of all, from the idea that tariffs are somehow going to be passed along directly to consumers and then some. And second of all, somehow that will translate into out-of-control inflation through expectations theory, which is the most absurd thing that economists have ever come up with. And economists actually know that. They just don't want to say it in public. So you've got bad theory piled up on something that isn't actually happening, isn't being observed, versus very real risks to employment that the Federal Reserve itself has documented in its own documentation. Talked about this before too with the Beige Book, how the Beige Book said we are actually seeing scattered layoffs. At first it was scattered reports of layoffs, but now we're seeing actual layoffs, even if they aren't pervasive. So while they don't see layoffs happening in a way that looks like a full-blown recession, more than a few of them can see that this is actually happening. There is a progression. There is material weakening. This is being observed today, whereas this inflation stuff is entirely theoretical. So already, straight away, this isn't the Sharks and the Jets. This is a bunch of theorists versus reality. And they know it too. While Powell may come down as among the theorists, he has proven to be pragmatic more often than not. So after the last payroll report, everybody said, okay, July rate cuts off the table. The labor market is strong, resilient, solid, whatever superlative you want to supply, or some even called it a blowout payroll report. And just on its face, 147,000 is not a blowout by any stretch of the imagination. Furthermore, even if we take it at face value, which you never should, the real important comparison here is not the change month to month. It's whether or not we're filling in the gap or closing the gap that was left behind from the pandemic ages ago. And as you can see, just here in 2025, that gap has grown bigger, not become smaller, because the payroll reports, even taken at face value, are nowhere near enough to keep up with just basic population, let alone trying to close the gap that's been left over from all the stupid policies back in 2020 and 2021, the impoverishment that went on. So in any real meaningful sense, the labor market is getting further and further behind. But even the statistics more recently in the establishment surveys, I pointed out, and I will continue to point out, hours worked. The hours index fell by 0.3% in the month of June. So while we had some teachers get hired in some state governments, hours worked tumbled in June. The average work week is at 34.2 hours, which, as you can see here, 34.2 hours would be the absolute weakest number for the entire 2010 silent depression, which was not actually a good time for anyone in the labor market. So hours worked, the average work week is down around recession levels. And with hours being weak, hourly earnings, maybe the most important component, the most important statistic in the entire establishment survey, not the headline, not even hours, hourly earnings. These are nominal hourly earnings. Not only did they decline in June, they declined in June for the second time in 3 months, which means that the 3-month change in average hourly earnings was fractionally negative. And while fractionally negative doesn't sound like all that big of a deal, it is almost never negative. In fact, it's almost never even close to negative. We're talking about average hourly earnings. For them to decline because hours were so weak, because employment was not strong and not solid, is incredibly rare, and this is something that we need to pay attention. This is what should have been the headline all over the financial media, not the solid headline payroll report. This is what everybody should have been talking about, not everything else. You could see On only a handful of occasions over the last 30 years have we seen a negative 3-month change for average earnings, average weekly earnings, which is, and that's just where all this begins, because it corresponds very strongly with all the spending problems that we do see too. Again, the point here is the FOMC, the parts of the FOMC that say inflation, it's entirely theoretical, whereas the other faction of the FOMC, assuming that it is actually a faction, it's really not, the other side of the FOMC talking about worries over weakness in the labor market, that's not a theory, that's being observed. And you can see in this case and several others that I don't have time to go over here, it's unusual degree of weakness. When you see this unusual level of weakness in paychecks, workers' paychecks, that's something that not only do you pay attention to, that's something that goes right to the top of the list of economic considerations. And this is also a data series that the FOMC does take seriously. They watch the establishment survey, not just the headline. So this is something that's going to make a difference in the discussions and deliberations as well. And then we get into the household survey side, which is another matter entirely. Basically, while the unemployment rate looks good, and while Jay Powell may talk about how the unemployment rate seems to make the labor markets appear to be solid, he knows the truth too. So do the rest of them. Employment absolutely crashed over the last couple of months, and I've gone over this a couple of times recently, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but the only reason the unemployment rate didn't skyrocket is because 750,000 Americans dropped out of the labor force because they can't find work. So even the unemployment rate that otherwise looks pretty good is not pretty good. And again, this is something that the FOMC is going to be very aware of too. The unemployment rate fell for the absolute worst possible reasons. The adjusted unemployment rate, when you start to take account of some of these labor force dropouts over the last couple of years, it's now about 1.5 million that should be in the unemployment, the official tally of unemployment. The adjusted unemployment rate is closer to 5% and rising, not stuck around 4.1 or 4.2%. So again, the point here is weakness in the economy and the labor market is real. It's happening. We can debate about what it means or how much of a worry it is, but it is there and happening, unlike, as we'll see, the inflation stuff. And it has gotten into consumer spending. It absolutely has, which is the thing that the FOMC and really economists and the financial media should be waiting for. Because all along they've said, as we've seen more and more concerning developments come up in the economy, well, at least consumers are spending. If consumers keep spending, everything will work out just fine. And as we entered 2025, suddenly we see consumers are not spending in the way they had before, and they're doing so in such an obvious way, it becomes obvious and visible on all the data and charts. Again, this is something the FOMC knows. It's not theoretical. It's something we can observe. And like the decline in average weekly earnings from the BLS and the labor data, the establishment survey, we have a 5-month decline in real personal consumption expenditures, which is it is equally as rare. It only happened once in the entirety of the 2010s as well. So we have unusual levels of weakness in the household survey. We've got unusual levels of decline in average weekly earnings. We've got unusual weakness and contraction over a prolonged 5-month period in personal spending. The real economy and its weakness is not theoretical. It's real, it's happening. In fact, I talked about this yesterday on our yesterday YouTube video. Amazon Prime, the fact that Amazon felt that Prime Day needed to be extended to 4 days is already an indication that things are not going well in the consumer economy, and they know it. And then we've gotten reports that the first day of Prime Day sales, even though it was extended, therefore we don't expect it to have the same level of sales as before, a consultant came out and said, well, we see Amazon sales down 41%. I don't think they're probably down that bad. And Amazon did come out and dispute it. But the fact that it even came up at all is emblematic, like the Prime Day going to 4 days, that it's representative of a consumer economy that has clearly shifted. Again, we can argue about what that means moving forward, or we can debate about the interpretation about how serious it is. But for the context of our discussion here, the FOMC discussion that's coming up at the end of July, weakness in the economy is not theoretical. Not only is it observable, it is observable in a way that we rarely see on these major mainstream economic accounts. Now, as far as the other side of things, the inflation side, even that has diminished. As we see here in the text from the FOMC minutes, members agreed that it was appropriate to acknowledge in the post-meeting statement, which we're talking about here, the minutes, that uncertainty about the economic outlook had diminished but remained elevated, and the committee was attentive to the risks to both sides of its dual mandate. They're also talking about employment risk here too. But the assessment that uncertainty had declined reflected in part a reduction in the expected level of tariffs, which appeared to peak in April and had subsequently declined. In other words, if the theoretical fears over inflation are based in large part on the expectation that tariffs are going to be enormous and therefore filter their way through the supply chain up to consumers, the fact that they're not going to be as exorbitant as first thought a couple months ago is indeed an acknowledgement that the theoretical worries about inflation were overstated to begin with. So even that side of it, the theory, the first step that's supposed to lead to this theoretical increase and maybe potential resurgence in inflation risk and consumer price risk, that hasn't materialized already. So the theory doesn't even have the first part of it observed, which is the tariff prices themselves are not going to be the worst cases that maybe people were thinking a couple months ago. That risk has already come down to begin with. So what that does is it opens the door for what I think is the Federal Reserve's most optimum choice. This is really why I believe the July rate cut is live. There's a couple other reasons, including that we're just repeating last summer. But the reason is because if the CPI, the next CPI, which is really the important economic statistic that we have to deal with here in July, that's left on the table other than retail sales, but really the CPI, if it comes in tame again, what that will mean is that all those who are still worried about the inflation side, even though they have no reason to be worried, they'll be able to say, well, we're more confident over consumer prices. We don't see the pressures. Therefore, that's taken some of the urgency and some of the fears off of the inflation side. Whereas on the other side, because they can point to the June employment data and say the headline payroll number was solid and strong, what they can do now is say, we're not really worried about the economy. We're more confident on inflation. Therefore, we're going to cut rates in July just out of an abundance of caution, which is basically what they were going to do last July before they talked themselves out of it. They have an open pathway, if the CPI agrees, to say, well, they won't say it in public that they're worried about employment, but they really are worried about employment, as we'll see in just a second. So while they're worried about employment, they can play down the risk to the economy while playing up the confidence over inflation, which allows them to sell a July rate cut as an insurance cut. We're just doing this out of an abundance of caution because there might be some risk to the labor market. We don't see an inflation risk, so we're just going to cut rates anyway, just in case. So it's actually the best case for the FOMC, and they're basically stating it here. The reason is because there absolutely is no inflation risk. It's just not there. And if anything, the tariffs are proving that consumer prices are not being passed up. They're not being passed along in the supply chain. I mean, just look at Chinese deflation, producer price deflation, which is a separate topic. I wrote about that in the deep dive analysis. But Chinese deflation, consumer prices, they're even tamer now than they've been at almost any point over the last several years after the phase shift. There is no inflation risk, and there hasn't been inflation risk since 2022. It's all theoretical. And what we've seen of consumer prices here over the last 3 months is that it actually corroborates and corresponds with the concerning economic data that I just went through, especially on average weekly earnings as well as spending. Weak consumer prices, it's all right there. So again, the theory, which is losing steam and losing any validity, whereas the observations of weakness in the economy, including from consumer prices, continues to build up. And by the way, I mean, the swap market told us inflation risk was done several years ago to begin with. Swap spreads have only gotten more and more compressed. So whatever the FOMC, even if tariffs did suddenly start to hit consumer prices over the months ahead, the swap market, the bond market, the rates markets have all said that it's not actually inflation risk, whatever the FOMC might interpret of them in the short run. And of course, this has been going on for the last couple of years. It leads into the economic weakness that we're seeing here. All of it is consistent with what the swap market has been pricing over the last couple of years, which is one of the things that we're going to go over here tonight on Eurodollar University's webinar. I do want to mention that one more time before we continue here. We're having an anniversary sale and webinar that has a lot to do with going over the swap market, its background, why we should pay close attention to it. What is it actually saying for where we are today? What is it actually saying about where we're going to be going forward from here? There's still some time to sign up for the webinar if you want to. There's a link in the description of this video as well as any other videos. There's a link for the webinar. Sign up on our homepage, eurodollar.university. It's going to be tonight, 6 o'clock Eastern time. Like I said, there's a lot of important stuff that's going on from the swap market. And this actually builds on the last webinar we did 3 months ago, just before the April chaos. There's a lot there that's certainly misunderstood by most mainstream considerations. So there's a lot to go over, and it's actually going to be a pretty extended webinar tonight. We've got a lot of stuff to get into. Link in the description to sign up. Last chance to do so. Let's get back to the FOMC. As much as I hate to do this, we got to get back to the FOMC. So the divide that shows, the media says the FOMC is divided, and it may seem like they're divided. Maybe they want you to think they're divided, but they're really not. There's not much of a divide as it seems to be, which is, again, one reason why I think that the July meeting is still open for a rate cut. And I think there's a better chance of a rate cut than no rate cut because I believe they want to cut rates. But they want to have the right reasons to do so, which, like I said, the insurance cut would allow them to do so. And in the text itself from the FOMC minutes, it's basically most participants assessed that some reduction in the target range for federal funds this year would be appropriate, noting that upward pressure on inflation from tariffs may be temporary or modest, which is exactly the worst case, and that medium and longer term inflation expectations have remained well anchored, which that doesn't matter because inflation expectations play no role in actual inflation, or that some weakening of economic activity and labor market conditions could occur because it's already occurring. In other words, the FOMC, even those that are afraid of consumer prices, what they call inflation, they acknowledge that it's not really a big possibility. It's not a huge possibility. They don't know. They're not willing to say for sure that it's a zero possibility or a very low possibility, but they're at least admitting here and doing so in the text by saying that, look, we're probably going to cut rates at some point this year. We just want to make sure that we're absolutely certain before we do so. So absolutely certain over a theory that isn't panning out versus economic weakness that can be observed already. So even right there, the FOMC is saying that the risks are not actually balanced. They're just taking the point that they're not really sure when they're going to move again. But as the minutes also say, a couple of participants did note that if the data does evolve in line with their expectations, and this is the dovish side of things, so they're really talking about here labor market trouble, which we saw a lot of that in the June payroll report, regardless of the headline, they would be open to considering a reduction in the target range for the policy rate as soon as the next meeting, which you'll note is the one here in July. The fact that this part is here in the text is very reminiscent of last July. And while you might say, well, it's just a couple of participants, it's not the majority, the vast majority of the FOMC is just a bunch of empty suits who will do basically what they're told anyway. While they spout opinions all over the financial media, it's really the most influential of the FOMC that will move the FOMC. And the influential of the FOMC is likely more than two here that we're talking about. And it's not just Waller and Bowman, but the fact that this is in the FOMC meeting minutes shows you that they are preparing for a rate cut, assuming that what they talk about here, the data evolve, that's going to be the CPI. No surprises in the CPI. They will give them the excuses to do what I said, which is to undertake the insurance cut. And the other reason I think that the July rate cut is live is because of the experience last year. So if you go to last July's meeting, the FOMC did not cut. If you remember, they were somewhat hawkish. They had been more hawkish in the springtime, saying sticky inflation, sticky inflation. Again, you can tell they have no idea where inflation comes from, what it is, because they're always wrong about it. Sticky inflation, we're not going to, it got to the point where you got to May and June, they were talking about not having any rate cuts at all in last year. As I pointed out previously, and I think when the FOMC meeting happened a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the dots from last June showed that the FOMC was expecting almost no rate cuts in the second half of 2024, and that there'd be 100 basis points of rate cuts in 2025. Well, the 100 basis points of rate cuts happened in 2024, which means that they're already behind the curve. Their estimates are already way too high to begin with, and their experience last year is definitely something that they're going to consider this year. Last year, what happened when we got to the July meeting with uncertainty, or really more observable weakness in the labor market, unemployment, and everything else happening throughout July, they still came across as relatively hawkish, voted not to cut rates at the end of July. Of course, the carry trade breakout was a couple days later. In fact, it was already happening as they were meeting. They didn't know that then. But essentially, they came off as relatively hawkish in July, only to come to regret it. They regretted it within a few days, and then when the meeting minutes came out in the middle of August, after the carry trade had already broken out, suddenly, after not really talking about rate cuts, after come across as hawkish at the meeting at Powell's press conference, just a couple weeks later, we get this passage in the meeting minutes which says, oh, we would have voted for a rate cut if one was available. Well, one is always available. So in other words, even in the meeting minutes that came out 3 weeks after the July meeting last year, they were expressing regrets that they didn't act at least preemptively given what happened afterward, given the balance of risks, which were not in favor of inflation because it was still theoretical, and that there were observable weaknesses all across the economy. So last year's experience is fresh in their mind this year, which accounts for, I think, one of the reasons why we saw the passage here where they made an explicit point of saying that some people are going to support a rate cut already at the July meeting. And as I said, the June payroll report will not change their mind because the details showed explicitly unusual degrees of weakness where the FOMC really takes a focus and attention. And just like last year, several observed that they would have cut rates. So it's the same thing we're seeing in the June 2020 or the July 2025 minutes, what were in the July 2024 minutes. So they're basically one meeting ahead of where they were last year because I think they want to avoid the same experience. So the FOMC is not as divided as they appear. The balance of risks they're not as they seem to. It's theory versus reality. So July meeting, I believe, is live. Just one final point, like I mentioned in the beginning here, bond vigilantes, interest rates. The reason that long-term interest rates continue to move back and forth, up and down, but not really going anywhere is simply the market trying to price not treasury debt or treasury supply or inflation risk. It's exactly what we're talking about here, trying to navigate the uncertainty of getting in the minds of empty-suited bureaucrats. So, when it looks like the FOMC might take in a data point like the June payroll and say that, well, that's going to be strong, therefore, there's no way the Fed's going to cut rates in July, long-term rates are going to go up because there's more uncertainty over the timing, not the destination, but the timing of the future path of short-term rates. We wish the Fed didn't have that ability to influence short-term rates, but they do, so that's the world we live in, not the one that we want. So while we keep hearing every time that we have these fluctuations where longer term rates go up, the media jumps on it as, oh, here we come with bond vigilantism. It's never, ever true. We've heard how many times over the last several years that treasury debt is somehow going to break the treasury market, and they always highlight these what are claimed to be poor auctions. I challenge anybody out there to look at this data and show me where there's a poor auction in any of it. In fact, when you look at some of the other auctions like the 2-year, it's very clear what's happening here. It's not bond vigilantism, it's all pricing. It's not about fears over debt, it's about the fundamentals that go into pricing. There's a direct relationship between the bids at the 2-year auction and the yield on the 2-year auction, which is, again, that makes sense, not bond vigilantism. So just to point that out as a final point here, because as the FOMC continues to get more and more out of the way, if they do follow through with a July rate cut, and it almost doesn't matter because they're going to cut by September anyway. Like I said, the swap market in particular has said the destination here has never been in doubt. It really hasn't been in doubt over the last couple of years. Going back to 2023, not coincidentally in the aftermath of the banking crisis. The swap market continued to price more and more confidently the destination was going to be low short-term interest rates and low interest rates overall, that we're going to go a lot lower and stay there a lot longer. And everything that has happened has fallen in place with that, including what the FOMC is doing, even if they can't do it all in a straight line, we don't expect them to, and even if they're waffling along the way, accounting for the variation in long-term interest rates over these short-run periods. So the takeaways here for today. July, I believe, is not only live. I think the FOMC minutes were intended to send the message that there's a good possibility. I don't know how good of a possibility. There is a very decent possibility that there is a rate cut in July, and that it's the CPI that will eventually determine that, not the last payroll report. Because the last payroll report, like I'll keep pointing out, lots of grim statistics and confirmation, observable confirmation, weakness is real. Again, we could debate about how weak it is and what that means moving forward, but it's there, it's observable, and it is already unusual. Whereas the CPI, this inflation idea, entirely theoretical, zero evidence of that anywhere, including the marketplace. So I think that opens the door for an insurance cut, which is exactly what the Fed would like to do in light of everything I just said, as well as last year's experience. So while I look forward to the day where we don't care about what the FOMC does, in fact, we don't even know who the chairman is or any of the policymakers, that may be a ways down the road. In the meantime, like I said, the swap market has pointed out the destination, and there's a lot of conversation and volatility in how we get there, and it's not meaningless. And so this is one of those mile markers or mileposts on the road to that way. One last thing that I didn't include here because I didn't want to spend too much time on it. I mean, I did a video on this a couple days ago too. Even the Federal Reserve Bank of New York put out a post where they said, we looked at forward rate markets and we can't discount the possibility that we see zero interest rate policy out of the Fed over the medium term ahead. Of course, they're downplaying the risk and only calculating based on forward markets, but even the Fed realizes there's something going on here. If only they would see beyond their ridiculous theories. But that's going to do it here for me. It's enough here for today. Let me get this off my screen if I can. There we go. Thank you, everybody, for joining me in the afternoon. We'll see you very soon. Very soon. Especially if you can join me with the webinar here tonight. There's a link in the description to sign up. I really do hope to see you there because there's a lot to go over. Everyone, have a great afternoon.